Good day, everyone, and welcome to Season 3 of the POSHpod, a podcast where we look at various grey areas under the POSH Act. This season, we're using a slightly different format. We're doing 10-minute episodes, which will hopefully make us slightly more bearable. I have with me Laxmi Char, who's the co-founder at Parity Consulting, sits on a number of ICs, internal committees that is, and has been working in this space for a very long time. My name is Bishen Jeswant. Hopefully you've seen us in the previous 2 seasons as well. If you haven't, please go and watch that. Shameless quick plug. My name is Bishen Jeswant. I'm a partner in the employment law practice at Siranamanch and Mangaldas and work in the employment law space and do the whole host of activities specializing in anti-sexual harassment law. Jumping straight into it, in this episode, we will be discussing the Vishaka Guidelines and why there was a new law required. So if you've been watching this podcast and work in the space, you probably don't need too much of an introduction about what the Vishaka Guidelines are. They were guidelines set out by the Supreme Court in 1997 for employers to deal with complaints of sexual harassment. Right, and since then, the law has changed. In 2013, we've had a new act, the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act 2013, which sets out a new entire regime for dealing with sexual harassment cases. So that's where we are at today, and we'll be discussing the difference between the two laws today and why there was a need for a new law.
So Bishen, again, like you said, cutting to the chase, right? We already had the Vishaka Guidelines, and these are Supreme Court guidelines, which effectively means that they're pretty hefty in terms of, legal gravitas. Why do we even need a POSH Act?
Yeah, that's a great place to, I think, start this discussion, Laxmi, because it's true that they were Supreme Court guidelines, which means that they were law. And the Supreme Court, in fact, when it set out the Vishaka Guidelines, made it pretty clear that this will have to be complied with by all employers, right? So it wasn't a case of them being suggestive guidelines, even though the name suggests that they are guidelines. Yeah, they were law and they were to be implemented by all employers, private employers included. And that was quite clear from the Supreme Court decision itself. So if there was any kind of misconception that they didn't have to be complied with because they were guidelines, that is purely a misconception. Regardless, the reality of it is it was put together in a fairly short period of time. It is not legislative action, which means maybe it doesn't go into the level of detail that you would expect of a statute. The Supreme Court laid down principles that had to be followed by employers more than, actual processes. So, and the Supreme Court made it quite clear in its decision itself that these guidelines are only meant to be in force till the time the government, the legislature comes out with a separate statute. So there was a directive in that judgment itself, in the Vishaka judgment itself, for the government, the legislature to come out with a new act. And that is what happened in 2013. 16 years it took from 1997. Some may say that's too long, but at least it did come about. So the 2013 Act, of course, is binding law, but the reality is the Vishaka Guidelines before that also was binding law. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, okay, it took 16 years, but hopefully in those 16 years, there was, a little bit more maybe research, a little bit more information. So what is there in the Act that, as an employment law practitioner, you are seeing valuable as compared to the Vishaka Guidelines?
Yeah, so Laxmi, there is a lot in the Act. The Act sets down in a great level of detail how a complaint is to be dealt with, for example, right? It sets out in more detail various definitions that were not there under the Vishaka Guidelines. For example, I think one of the most important definitions in the Act is that of an aggrieved woman, right? So the Act makes it very clear that an aggrieved woman does not have to be an employee. That wasn't entirely clear under the Vishaka Guidelines. So the Vishaka Guidelines did set out that third parties can raise complaints as well. Right? But here there is a clear definition. So various defined terms like aggrieved woman were set out in great detail in the POSH Act. Processes and timelines, which were not there in the Vishaka Guidelines. For example, that a complaint has to be dealt with within 90 days, the period of time within which it must be sent to the respondent, get a reply from the respondent, the 7-day, 10-day periods for those, 60 days for an employer to implement decisions of the IC, etc. So a great level of detail about the various processes, the various definitions, essentially more clarity and drilling down about, everything, including the constitution of an IC, the great detail about what should be the qualifications of each member of the internal committee. So all of those details came out through the Act, and therefore, for all the deficiencies of the Act, it's broadly still a fairly good legislation that does improve on the Vishaka Guidelines and makes compliance easier because of the clarity and steps and processes it lays out.
Yeah, and I can tell you, speaking as a non-lawyer, I mean, reading through the Act itself it's refreshing because I can actually understand what the Act wants me to do.
Yeah.
And I think that is so important when it comes to, requirements like this, which are outside of the niche legal world. Because if I know what you want me to do, it's easier for me to actually do it.
Fair. Fully agree. Fully agree.
Yeah. Yes, again, we talked about, okay, what is the extra that the Act brings in? But is there something that maybe already exists in the Vishaka Guidelines that would be recommended that, hey, employers, pay attention to this element, even though it might not be specified in the Act, but it makes, good sense to incorporate that as well?
Not a whole lot, Lakshmi, because I mean, like we discussed at the start of this episode, the act came about because the Vishaka judgment said, the government should legislate on the subject. Until the time the government legislates, the guidelines will be in place. So the inspiration for the act is the guidelines. So there isn't a whole lot in the guidelines, that's not there in the act. Most of it is covered. But there are a couple of points that we could still, talk about. One is the fact that under the guidelines, there was a stronger obligation on the employer to raise complaints with the police. Under the Act, it's a bit differently worded, and I think the Act is better in this regard, in that an employer needs to only assist a woman employee, woman victim, to go to the police if she so desires. Right? There isn't a proactive obligation on the employer's part to do so. The language under the Vishaka Guidelines could be interpreted to have a stronger obligation on the employer to be more proactive with, raising police complaints. So that is one, and I think the Act is better in this regard. The other small point is the Vishaka Guidelines had a provision on seeking feedback from employees, a stronger obligation to listen to employees in gatherings between employer and between the employer and employees, to have discussions and understand, practices in relation to anti-sexual harassment, an environment at the workplace. That is a strong obligation that's not there under the POSH Act. Sure, under the POSH Act, there is a requirement to sensitize employees. There are training sessions conducted based on obligations under the POSH Act. But this is a proactive obligation as a best practice, which maybe employers could still take inspiration from the POSH Act and have separate communications, interactions, conversations with employees on how they perceive the workplace to be. Is it a safe workplace? Are there changes that employees recommend? Essentially hearing employees proactively before there is an issue, and not as a one-sided training session, but more as a two-way conversation, is something which the Vishaka Guidelines did envisage, which the POSH Act doesn't set out in so many words. So that is one area where I think, there is opportunity for employers to take some inspiration and, have more processes in place to listen to employees more.
Nice.
And, on that note, Lakshmi, I'd like to ask you a question actually. Sure. Since you are seeing these cases live, right? You are sitting on committees, you're dealing with employers, dealing with, complaints on a day-to-day basis. Can you tell us a little bit about how you are seeing a change in the attitude of employers over the years after the POSH Act? Has there been a greater focus on compliance? Are they looking at the Act more, seriously?
All right. 10 years, right, of the POSH Act itself. So if I look back, and I want to stress that this is anecdotal, this is not research based or anything like that, but anecdotally, I think the Vishaka Guidelines were really in the nice to have rather than the need to have bucket, using corporate speak, right? Now with the POSH Act, it has become a need to have. You need to have an IC. It needs to be separate from your regular HR, workplace grievance redressal mechanism and all that good stuff. So I'm definitely seeing more rigor in India Inc. broadly, when compared to pre-POSH Act. Very interestingly, Bishen, I'm also seeing kind of like a maturity evolution even in the past 10 years, right? It started off, frankly, just focusing on are we getting complaints? What are we going to do with it? So if you look at the Act itself, although we call it the POSH Act, it's really prevention, prohibition, redressal, right? But everybody was just focused on the redressal part. Let's set up an IC and let's make sure that we are addressing the complaints. Today, exactly to the point that you raised earlier, organizations are understanding, hey, let's do kind of like a culture dipstick. Let's see if as a workplace, we are growing and evolving, becoming more inclusive, becoming more mature in the way that we are dealing with different people. And is sexual harassment one element of that, right? Which every employee deserves and requires to be protected at work. So I'm definitely seeing that growth, that evolution. And for that, I'm grateful to the Act. Because I don't know, and I would hate to this thing, but I don't know if we would have been at this point if it was not for the Act being passed and made mandatory.
Lovely. That's very heartening to hear, and I'm sure our listeners as well are happy to hear that there is this change, positive change on the part of employers across the country, and that can only bode well for the future. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you all for listening. Please do write in and share your comments, share your thoughts, and we will try and get back to each of you in the comment section as well. Look forward to you in the next episode.
Yes, please let us know what you think. Bye and see you again.